Let's be clear from the beginning that the ruling billionaire plutocracy does not hold elections in the United States to let ordinary people have a real say in what the government does. That has never been the case since George Washington and the founding fathers created the system of government that we have, which is designed to make sure that the real decisions are always made by the very rich. But given that that's the reason that the ruling class holds elections in the first place, it's still worth paying a little bit of attention to the promises that some of the politicians are making to see what's really going on. So in this video, I'd like to say a few words about Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. So Elizabeth Warren has just issued a new policy statement about what to do about illegal immigration. And basically, what Elizabeth Warren is saying is, by her silence on the question, let's keep forcing these people in Central America and Mexico to have to cross the border into the United States just to survive. Let's keep forcing them to do that with all the means and devices that the ruling class has been using for decades and decades under all the different administrations, supporting dictatorships that attack mercilessly with death squads the peasants and set up drug gangs as the local rulers over people, so that people are frightened to stay in Central American countries and to just survive, migrate north and cross over into the United States. And with NAFTA dumping cheap corn into Mexico by subsidizing American agribusiness to do that, to force the Mexican small farmers out of business and to force them to look for where there are jobs. And of course, there are not enough jobs in Mexico for them. Some jobs in the sweatshops that NAFTA created right south of the border. But they look for work as in the United States as the cheap labor, especially agricultural labor, picking crops for practically nothing. And the American corporate elite makes very good use of this cheap labor. It's cheap because the people are afraid of being deported if they, do the normal things like, try to form a union and demand higher wages and better working conditions. Although there have been some efforts, even some successful ones in that regard, which to the amazing credit of the migrant workers who face deportation doing it. But on the whole, they're made into cheap labor. And yes, indeed, this does drive American workers out of jobs that used to pay more, various forms of construction work and so forth. And yes, the influx of huge numbers of illegal immigrants does indeed put a heavy burden on towns for social services and so forth. Towns which the ruling class makes sure don't have enough money even for the citizens. And so what you have is a situation where Elizabeth Warren, by her silence on the way that the ruling class forces people to migrate illegally into the United States, is essentially saying in her new proposal, let's keep forcing huge numbers of people to illegally come into the United States and be cheap labor, but let's make it a little more pleasant for them so it doesn't ruffle the feathers of the humanitarians in the country, who quite understandably and commendably are horrified by the mistreatment of these people, especially the children in cages, but all sorts of other things. I just heard that they deliberately keep the temperature low to make it uncomfortable and to make it so people get sick with, catching colds and so forth. It is atrocious what the administrations, and not just Trump, the Obama administration as well before, are doing to these people. So Elizabeth Warren is going to, say, I'm going to represent the people who, want conditions to be a little bit better for these people, whom we will continue to force to cross the border to work as cheap labor in the United States. And, that's a setup for Trump and people like him to emphasize that this cheap labor is harming American working class citizens, which it is. That's true. And he also will ignore the fact that the plutocracy that he is beholden to is forcing these people to cross the border. See, that's the huge elephant in the living room that both Elizabeth Warren and Trump completely ignore, so they can play their little game of pitting the half of the population that cares more about the terrible, inhumane conditions of the migrant workers, and versus the other half of the population who, for quite understandable reasons, focuses mainly on the problem of their jobs being undercut by cheap labor that's too cowed into submission by the fear of deportation to join the fight for higher wages and better working conditions. It's a perfect divide and rule game. It's perfect. And the perfection of it can be measured by just how close to 50% of the population is on one side versus 50% on the other side. Perfect divide and rule gets it right down the middle. And this immigration issue is pretty damn perfect. So that's Elizabeth Warren. Now, when it comes to Israel, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, by the way, everything I said about Elizabeth Warren applies to Bernie Sanders. He'll no doubt come out with some statement about immigration, which will be essentially identical in this regard. Now, when it comes to Israel, I want to point out something that a lot of people seem to be confused about. Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren absolutely, 100%, unambiguously support the ethnic cleansing of non-Jews from the 78% of Palestine that is now called Israel. And actually it's more than 78% because the settlers have expanded so that it's more than 78% of Palestine is essentially now called Israel. And in 1947 to 49 and 1967, and continuing today in various ways, the ruling class of Israel, which is a billionaire ruling class that is oppressing ordinary Jews economically horribly, this billionaire ruling class, embracing the ideology of Zionism, which is the ideology that says that there has to be a Jewish state that's always guaranteed, no matter what, to be at least 80% Jewish population. This Zionist billionaire ruling class in Israel is carrying out immoral, violent, racist, ethnic cleansing of the non-Jews, the Palestinians, driving them out of at least the 78% of Palestine where they used to live for generations and generations, driving them out in the name of making Israel a Jewish state that's at least 80% Jewish. Now, why are the billionaires doing this? Are they doing it to make life safer or better for ordinary Jews? Absolutely not. The purpose is to create a boogeyman enemy, the Palestinians, with which to frighten ordinary Jews into obedience to the Israeli billionaire ruling class that pretends, that claims, that purports to be protecting ordinary Jews from their real enemy, ordinary Palestinian people. It's a scam. It's the war on terror done for ordinary Jews in Israel, just like the war on terror is using a boogeyman enemy to frighten ordinary Americans into obedience to our billionaire ruling class. This is the scam needs a credible boogeyman enemy, and Israel, with its ethnic cleansing of Palestinians, produces that enemy. Angry Palestinians. They're angry at being the victims of ethnic cleansing, but of course the media says they're angry because they hate Jews. And this is the scam. Well, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren never even hint that this is an immoral, terrible scam. They never even hint that the ethnic cleansing is wrong. Now, it gets a little complicated here. People say, oh, but Bernie Sanders is for the two-state solution, and he's very critical of Netanyahu. So what? The two-state solution means that the more than 78% of Palestine, which has been cleansed almost entirely of its non-Jewish population, will remain forever and ever and ever barred to the return of the non-Jews that were violently removed from it and who are living, many of them, millions of them, in refugee camps elsewhere. The two-state solution says they will never be allowed to return. They will never be allowed to exercise their right of return, which is the number one demand of Palestinians, is that they be allowed to exercise that fundamental right of return. The two-state solution says, no, you will never be allowed to exercise that right of return. You will have to be satisfied with a little tiny postage stamp sized, some people would call it a Bantustan, because that's what the South African apartheid people offered the blacks before apartheid was abolished. A little postage stamp size, quote, state, unquote, over which Israel will have the real control, barring who can go in and out of it and everything else, like the way they control Gaza, which is officially not part of Israel. And the Palestinians will be told, here, this is what you're going to have to be satisfied with. Yeah, you'll be allowed to hoist a Palestinian flag and have the trappings of a state, but you're never going to be allowed to have your right of return to undo the horrible crime of the ethnic cleansing of millions of people from where they've lived for generations and generations and had all their property stolen from them too, by the way. They're never going to be allowed to have the rights that Jews had after World War II to get their property back and to go back to Germany if they wanted to. No, siree. That's what the two-state solution is. So the fact that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are for the two-state solution and disagree with Netanyahu, who is, delaying its implementation, doesn't make them on the side of the angels. It makes them on the side of ethnic cleansing. And this ethnic cleansing is for the purpose of creating the boogeyman enemy to make the war on terror credible. And the purpose of the war on terror is to control us, so that the ruling plutocracy of both Israel, the Israeli billionaires, and the ruling plutocracy in the United States, which is mainly non-Jewish billionaires, can control us with this boogeyman enemy that's created with ethnic cleansing to make them angry. So don't go telling me that Bernie Sanders, is a good position on Israel. It's absolutely the opposite. He doesn't. And if these politicians simply told the truth about how horribly the Zionist leaders have treated ordinary Jews ever since the Holocaust days, then the public would turn against the Israeli leaders and the Israeli government, overnight. If the public was informed about how these Israeli leaders, the Zionist leaders back during World War II, sabotaged rescue efforts of Jews to rescue them from the Nazis. Why? Because if the rescue effort involved giving the Jews a haven in somewhere other than Palestine, the Zionists opposed it. I'll provide links. You can read about this. You don't have to take my word for it. You can read what the chief rabbi of England wrote about it in a letter to the Times of London. He was shocked by the betrayal of the Zionist leaders of ordinary European Jews. But will Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders ever tell the American public the truth about these upper-class, horrible Israeli Jewish leaders who betray their own people? Of course not, because they are beholden to the upper class, the Israeli upper class and the American upper class. Let's not forget that. Thank you.